good. I'm getting over not walking. It's rough.
What if the man who made the world laugh left his own children in tears? Jerry Lewis was a comedy legend, a Hollywood icon, and a hero to millions. But behind the slapstick genius and glowing spotlight was a family story no one saw coming. That's no way to treat a customer. Try it like this. With those words and a crooked smile, Jerry Lewis charmed America. A master of slapstick and sentiment, he lit up screens with his wild energy and comedic genius. From the 1950s to his famous telethons, Lewis wasn't just a performer, he was a cultural icon. But behind the manic laughter and stardom was a private man whose life was far more complicated. His legacy wasn't just his comedy, it was also the silent sorrow left behind in the hearts of his children. While millions saw a man who brought joy, his own family often lived in the shadow of neglect, rejection, and emotional distance. This is the story of those children, 8 in total, who each carried their own version of what it meant to be Jerry Lewis's son or daughter. Their stories paint a portrait not of a celebrity, but of a father whose personal life bore the cost of his public greatness. Born in 1946, Gary Lewis was Jerry's first child with his first wife, singer Patty Palmer. At a glance, Gary had it all: a famous father, a privileged life, and later a successful music career as frontman for Gary Lewis and the Playboys. With chart toppers in the 1960s, Gary appeared poised to carry the Lewis legacy forward. But inside, he struggled. Jerry, he claimed, was emotionally abusive, distant, and cold. "I can't tell you one good thing he ever did for me," Gary once said. Despite his early success, Gary was drafted into the Vietnam War. When he returned, the spotlight had moved on. So had Jerry. In 2017, Jerry Lewis passed away. In his will, he explicitly disinherited Gary and 5 of his siblings. No money, no message of peace, only silence. Gary has since lived quietly, still making music. He carries a pain that doesn't shout, it lingers. Though never truly acknowledged by his father, Gary forged his own identity, one not defined by fame, but by endurance. Born in 1952, Susan Minoret is widely believed to be Jerry's illegitimate daughter from an affair with model Lynn Dixon. Unlike Jerry's sons, Susan never had the privilege of being acknowledged. No public recognition, no embrace, only a whisper of connection. Susan didn't grow up in Beverly Hills, but in ordinary surroundings with the haunting knowledge of a father who could have changed her life with a single word. A DNA test reportedly confirmed her paternity, yet Jerry stayed silent. Her later life was marked by hardship. At one point, she was homeless on the streets of Philadelphia, her resemblance to her father a bitter irony to passers-by. She said she never wanted money, only acknowledgement. "I just wanted to be called his daughter." Jerry never did. Born in 1964, Joseph was the youngest of Jerry's sons with Patty. Sensitive and artistic, he seemed to yearn for love that never came. Rumors suggested Jerry wanted a daughter instead of another son, a disappointment that hung over Joseph's childhood. As he grew older, Joseph battled depression and substance abuse. Addiction became an escape from the pain of rejection. In 2009, he died of a heroin overdose at age 45. His death barely registered in the media. Even in death, Jerry excluded him from his will, publicly stating his intention to disinherit him. The final insult wasn't financial, it was emotional. No tribute, no closure, just more silence. Joseph's story is a testament to the damage that an absence of love can do. He didn't want the spotlight, just a father. Born in 1959, Anthony was one of the few children who broke the silence. In interviews, he described a household riddled with emotional abuse and violence. "My father hit me with a belt and emotionally abused us every day," he said. For Anthony, speaking out wasn't vengeance, it was survival. His relationship with Jerry was already fractured when, after the divorce, he sued his father for support on behalf of his mother. To outsiders, it seemed like a bitter family feud, but for Anthony, it was about justice. Unsurprisingly, Jerry excluded him from his will. Anthony today lives quietly without fame or fanfare, but he holds something stronger than bitterness, the truth. His courage to speak about pain in a family built on laughter offered a voice to all those who felt silenced by legacy. Born in 1957, Christopher stayed away from the public narrative. He never gave interviews or spoke about his father, but silence, as we know, is not always peace. It can be a form of protection. Christopher chose to work behind the scenes in television, away from fame and away from his father's shadow. He was also excluded from Jerry's will and did not attend the funeral. No headlines, no final words, just a clean break. Perhaps Christopher found in silence the healing his siblings sought in words. Sometimes survival doesn't look like confrontation, it looks like distance. Scott, born in 1956, also lived quietly. He never accused his father publicly of abuse, but the pain was still visible. After Jerry's death, Scott remarked, "We're his sons, not his punchlines." The statement was brief but loaded. He had worked behind the scenes in TV, much like Christopher. For Scott, being the son of Jerry Lewis was less a privilege and more a burden. He lived in the wake of a man who made millions laugh, but often failed to love. In 1949, Jerry and Patty adopted Ronald, their first child. A deliberate act of love, one would hope. But Ronald's life remained mostly undocumented. No interviews, no scandal, but no sign of connection either. He didn't attend Jerry's funeral and was excluded from the will. It's painful to imagine being chosen, only to be forgotten. For Ronald, the silence of his upbringing speaks volumes. In a family already marked by absence, he existed even further on the fringes. In 1992, Jerry adopted Danielle with his second wife, Sandy Pitnick. By then, he was in his 60s and long past the chaos of raising 6 boys. For the first time, Jerry had the daughter he once wished for. Danielle, by all accounts, was deeply loved by her father. Photos show affection, closeness, warmth, images that stand in stark contrast to his earlier years as a parent. She was the only child named in Jerry's will. But even her story is complex. Danielle grew up aware of the fractures surrounding her family name. While she hasn't spoken publicly about her siblings, the divide must have shaped her in quiet ways. Today, she lives privately, never using her father's fame for attention. Perhaps that's her way of honoring the painful silence left behind. Jerry Lewis gave the world laughter, but at what cost? Fame in the golden age of Hollywood demanded perfection, and that pressure often left his family behind. His children, some forgotten, some disowned, some silent, each bear a unique piece of the emotional fallout. Their lives tell a different story than the one we watched on screen. They reveal the darker truths about parenting in the spotlight, about ego, and about the limits of legacy. They remind us that greatness in public does not always translate to greatness in private. When Jerry Lewis passed away, he left behind more than comedy and film. He left behind people, his children, and their stories, often hidden, are part of the legacy too. Gary, who once found fame but never fatherly love. Susan, who lived on the margins, longing to be acknowledged. Joseph, who spiraled in silence. Anthony, who dared to speak. Christopher and Scott, who walked away. Ronald, who was chosen but never embraced. And Danielle, the daughter who finally felt cherished, yet carried the weight of a broken past. These stories may not be the ones Hollywood tells, but they're just as important. They speak to the cost of greatness, to the wounds we don't see, to the truth behind the applause. Jerry Lewis will always be remembered as a comedic legend, but for those who knew him as Dad, the picture is far more complicated. The story of Jerry Lewis and his children is not just a tale about celebrity estrangement. It's a poignant reflection on the hidden costs of fame, especially when it intersects with fatherhood. As one of the most recognizable figures of the 20th century, Lewis built a reputation as a comedic genius. On screen, he was zany, loud, and unforgettable, delighting millions with his wild antics and slapstick brilliance. But off-screen, behind the stage lights and the perpetual laughter, existed a private world often marked by distance, dysfunction, and emotional neglect. In his prime, Jerry Lewis was everywhere, on film sets, television screens, variety shows, and national telethons. His dedication to performance and charitable work made him a household name, especially through his long-standing involvement with the Muscular Dystrophy Association. But while he tirelessly gave to the public, it seems he struggled to give something far more personal to his own children: love, consistency, and emotional presence. Take Gary Lewis, his eldest son, for example. Gary was born into fame and expectations. With the surname Lewis, he inherited more than just genetics. He inherited the pressure of being the son of an entertainment giant. For a brief moment in the 1960s, Gary managed to carve his own name into the musical charts with his band, Gary Lewis and the Playboys. He found success independent of his father's towering shadow. But even as his music soared, his relationship with Jerry grew more brittle. In interviews, Gary would later describe his father in painful terms: emotionally cold, abusive, and unloving. Their connection never truly mended, and when Jerry died, he left Gary and 5 of his brothers out of his will entirely. To Gary, the financial exclusion was less of a loss than the confirmation of what he had long suspected, that he had never been truly loved by his father. Then there's the quiet, aching story of Susan Minaret, a woman who believed she was Jerry Lewis's illegitimate daughter. Unlike Gary, Susan didn't have the perks of the Lewis name. Born outside the bounds of marriage, her life was shaped by the absence of acknowledgement. She didn't seek money, only recognition, a simple human desire to be claimed. She endured her entire life without that basic validation. At one point, a DNA test reportedly confirmed her biological connection to Jerry, but he never spoke her name publicly or acknowledged her existence. She would go on to struggle with poverty and homelessness, her face sometimes recognized by strangers who saw echoes of Jerry in her eyes. But in the eyes of her father, she was invisible. Another tragedy in this family's history is the fate of Joseph Lewis, the youngest of Jerry's biological sons. While the public may remember Jerry as a charismatic force, Joseph remembered him as a distant, often cruel figure. Sensitive and artistic, Joseph struggled under the weight of unmet emotional needs. He found little comfort in the family dynamic and eventually turned to drugs as a means of coping with his internal pain. His battle with addiction would ultimately take his life. In 2009, he died of a heroin overdose. Yet even after his death, and nearly a decade before Jerry's own, Joseph was formally disinherited in his father's will. It was a stark, cruel punctuation on a relationship that had already been broken. No tributes, no warm remembrances, only absence. Some of the other Lewis children chose different paths in response to their upbringing. Anthony Lewis, for example, did not stay silent. In rare interviews, he spoke out about the physical and emotional abuse he endured, detailing how his father would lash out with belts and harsh words. Speaking his truth wasn't easy. Jerry was a beloved public figure, and calling him out risked backlash. But for Anthony, the cost of silence was too high. He carried his pain publicly, not to destroy his father's reputation, but to reclaim his own voice. At one point, Anthony even filed a lawsuit to help support his mother, Patty Palmer, when Jerry left her financially vulnerable. It was an act of loyalty to the parent he believed had truly cared for him, even if it permanently cemented the rift with his father. Christopher and Scott Lewis represent yet another dimension of this family's fractured legacy, those who neither lashed out nor broke down, but quietly removed themselves from the narrative. Both men stayed behind the scenes in television production, deliberately avoiding the spotlight their last name might have afforded them. They lived quietly, giving no interviews and rarely commenting on their father's legacy. Their silence was not an endorsement of Jerry Lewis's parenting. It was a form of self-preservation. For Christopher and Scott, stepping away from the chaos may have been the only way to find peace. But even peace is complicated when it comes wrapped in neglect. Scott, in a rare moment of candor, once remarked, "We're his sons, not his punchlines." His words carried the weight of decades of being seen as less than human by a man who made the world laugh. Then there is Ronald Lewis, the adopted son, whose story remains the most mysterious. Brought into the family in 1949, Ronald was Jerry and Patty's first child, chosen rather than born. In a perfect world, that would have made his bond with Jerry even stronger. But Ronald's story is a ghost story, a presence acknowledged only in legal records, not in love or family lore. He remained outside of public life, not because he had nothing to say, but perhaps because there was no space for him to be heard. He was excluded from the will, omitted from interviews, and absent at Jerry's funeral. If Ronald carried bitterness, the world never heard it. But in that silence, one can sense the weight of being unchosen, even after being chosen. And then, finally, we come to Danielle, Jerry's adopted daughter from his second marriage to Sandy Pitnick. Adopted in 1992, she represented a different chapter in Jerry's life. Older, perhaps softer, Jerry seemed to finally embrace fatherhood in a more traditional sense. Danielle was showered with attention, photographed with her father, and by all accounts deeply loved. She was the only child mentioned in his will, and the only one who seemed to know a Jerry Lewis who had learned, at least in part, how to nurture. But even her privileged place in the family comes with complicated undertones. As the only child truly embraced, she also became the living symbol of what the others never had. A father who was present, warm, and willing to claim them. Danielle has never spoken publicly about her family's fractured past, and perhaps that silence is her own kind of grace. The pattern running through all these lives is unmistakable. Emotional inconsistency, rejection, neglect, and a deep yearning for something that should have been simple. Fatherly love. Jerry Lewis gave the world joy, but many of his children only received absence. This contradiction is not unique in Hollywood. Many icons revered by millions struggle to give emotionally at home what they so easily give on stage. But Jerry's case is particularly haunting because of the scale. Of his 8 children, only 1 received a full measure of public love. The rest were left with varying degrees of pain, estrangement, and silence. This story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about legacy and perception. We often measure a life by public accomplishments, awards, applause, box office numbers. But a more intimate measure lies in how we treat those closest to us when the cameras aren't rolling. For all his brilliance, Jerry Lewis left behind a deeply wounded family. And the real tragedy is not just in what happened, but in how quietly it happened. There were no tell-all memoirs, no media spectacles. Just a slow, quiet erosion of familial bonds. These stories also challenge the myth of the perfect Hollywood family. For decades, images of smiling stars with their picture-perfect children have filled magazine covers and television specials. But behind many of those smiles are complex, painful realities. Jerry Lewis's children lived in the shadow of his fame, often unseen and unheard, even as the world celebrated their father. And while not all of them were ready or willing to share their pain, the fragments that have surfaced tell a collective story of love denied. It's easy to criticize Jerry Lewis in hindsight, but his story also prompts deeper questions about the nature of celebrity, emotional intelligence, and generational trauma. Was his behavior shaped by the times he lived in? By the pressure of fame? By his own unresolved issues from childhood? These are questions without clear answers, but they matter nonetheless. Because in examining the flaws of icons, we gain insight into our own culture, what we value, what we ignore, and what we're willing to forgive. For the Lewis children, forgiveness may still be elusive. Some have made peace with their past, others have not. But all of them have had to carry the burden of a legacy that brought the world laughter but left them in tears. Their stories, quiet as they may be, are a reminder that behind every great man is a family, and every family has its own truths, however difficult. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson from this saga. That greatness, true greatness, isn't only about talent or success, it's about presence, empathy, and the quiet acts of love that never make the headlines. Jerry Lewis made millions laugh, but for many of his children, the silence he left behind speaks louder than all the applause. And maybe that's what this story is really about. Not just a famous man, but the quiet truths of the people who lived in his shadow. The children who didn't ask for the spotlight, but were shaped by it nonetheless. Their stories deserve to be heard, not because of who their father was, but because of who they are. If this story moved you or made you see things in a new light, hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments.